Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to the Valley of the Judged. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me, as always, is my good brother here in the temple, coming to us from the Story to Illuminations, good brother Monarch. Say something. Monarch, you alive, or did lightning strike you again? Also, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I forgot to unmute myself there. Technical difficulties on my end. Pay no attention.
Uh-huh. I'll remember that the next time you get on me for technical difficulties. But we are back. We are back with our now that we're back at it with our continued look at Mysteries of the Yokai. Last time around, we handled the back end of character creation, as well as character advancement, and now it's time to handle the combat system, or rather, conflict. Because combat is not just exchanging swords, but exchanging words or spells just as much.
Yes, that's been a bit of a theme in everything we've gone over in the prior streams on Yokai. Is combat is not necessarily the key to conflict resolution in this game.
Yeah.
It's certainly a possible outcome, but not a foregone conclusion.
Mm-hmm. So, we open up with this chapter describes the different mechanics available to GMs and players whenever there is conflict in the story. This can be as simple as a character attempting to pick a lock, or as complex as a political debate that takes an entire game session. Depending on the needs of the gaming group, several options are available. And the three ways are story resolution, use the current state of the story, checks, roll dice, and conflict tracker, tide and morale. Players and NPCs take multiple actions to defeat the opposing side. The conflict tracker will be getting its own special attention, since they decided to give it its own page, and when I grabbed the game, its own PDF. So it's going to get suitable amount of attention from us. But since that was short, I'll take the story resolution. Story resolution is pretty straightforward. It's just role playing the matter. Now the second one, checks. This is where things are going to get interesting. Checks are the standard way of resolving actions attempted by a character when there is a chance of failure. The most basic check simply uses an attribute. This is done for anything that requires the character's raw, untrained ability. In many cases, a character can attempt an action with a skill check. If the character has an appropriate skill for the situation, they can apply it to the task and receive a higher chance than with a attribute alone. Some special abilities in the game also have their own checks. For example, an illusion would require a check to be made to see if the characters witnessing illusion believe it, or find some flaw that gives them a reason to question it. Finally, the tide and morale system, described on page 105, uses a series of opposed checks, usually the attack and defend actions, between the players and their enemies. And then we have the basics mechanics of making a check. Whenever a character is required to make a check, the player or GM rolls 3d6, applies. This is pretty much revisiting the core mechanic. Roll 3d6, apply modifiers compared to a target number. What I will note is that they give a few detailed examples on opposed checks using the same skills, and opposed check using different skills.
Now, we won't go through all these, but I'll note I always appreciate this much detail and examples.
Mm-hmm. See, then we have situational modifiers, which is self-explanatory. We can pretty much skip that part.
Yeah.
Although, once again, I appreciate that it gives examples for unopposed checks and and opposed checks, and environmental modifiers, and modifiers invoked by players. There's also a sidebar about stacking ability modifiers. There are many temporary modifiers that can affect characters. Modifiers from any game mechanic, such as a technique with the same name, do not stack, even if they come from different sources. Only use the highest positive or lowest negative modifier. Different sources that affect the same ability are combined. This is basically saying that you can't double up from the same source of bonus, and when you have both positive and negative mods in this to the same ability from the same sources, find the highest, subtract it with the lowest negative, and ignore any lesser modifiers. I'd say that's a good way to resolve the order of operations when it comes to getting modifiers from a bunch of different sources.
Yeah. But then we'll move on to Tide and Morale. Extended conflict resolution. So, for situations where a single check would not resolve a conflict, the GM should use the conflict tracker. Characters take actions that are resolved using checks and inflict tide damage. This models the ebb and flow of a conflict. When enough tide damage has been inflicted against one side, the tide bar breaks and morale damage is inflicted to that side. Morale damage is more serious than tide damage. When a side has taken enough morale damage, characters on that side are forced to leave combat. Once all opponents have been forced out of combat, the remaining side wins. I will say I think they probably should have said conflict there, just for consistency purposes.
Plus combat is going. I think the reason that they're using conflict instead of combat with a lot of these terms is because of the fact that the word combat is going to put certain images in people's heads.
Yeah. That's why I think they probably shouldn't have used combat in this description, because this seems like how it's handling.
I'd imagine it's an artifact, something
Yeah.
that the editing team didn't quite catch.
Yeah, most likely.
I mean, I can't say definitively that's what happened, but we've been through enough of these to know editing gaffes when we see it.
Yeah.
But I do like that we have a bit of a breakdown about what goes where.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wish certain games would do this with how you're supposed to lay out the character sheet. Obviously, that's not much of a problem for this game, but we've seen games where we're trying to figure out, okay, what exactly goes where and how should it be detailed on a character sheet. And for anyone thinking that would be obvious, sometimes the obvious is not so much.
Especially when you get like the more complex games, it's not likely going to be as obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, then we go on to using tide and morale, the basics. The purpose of the conflict tracker is to provide an in-depth way for the gaming group to track progress. You can use it for physical battlefields, the tense negotiations of royal court, or even a foot race between characters. You can use the conflict tracker anytime you need to resolve a situation that requires more than one check. For extended checks, there will be times when a GM may want to use the tide system alone. When two sides are opposed in a challenge that is more important than a single opposed check, but doesn't need a full combat to be resolved, the GM can use the rules for tide damage to model the actions each side takes, ending the conflict whenever one side breaks the tide bar. I am just going to say, going forward, if you hear us say combat, assume it's just conflict in general.
Pretty much, because that's good.
Yeah, I'm not going to catch myself every time I read that, because it keeps switching back and forth. That is a little annoying.
It's a little annoying, but it's one of those. It's one of those things that is inevitably going to happen.
Yeah. So yeah, generally, just assume if I say combat, I'm most likely meaning conflict unless it specifies otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
In setting the kind of conflict and determining allowed actions. The conflict resolution rules for Mysteries of the Yokai are designed to be equally usable no matter the source of the conflict. Combat on the battlefield, investigations, exorcisms, court intrigues, even a ramen eating contest. All can be resolved using tide and morale. When the GM chooses to start a conflict, they announce to the players that the game is shifting from story resolution to conflict resolution. The conflict tracker is set up, and the game becomes measured in rounds. During a round, each character will have a turn during which they can use actions to support their side or harm the opposing side. Characters use actions to inflict tide damage, which pushes the tide bar tracker back and forth. Whenever you inflict tide damage on an opponent, the tide of battle is pushed against that character's side. At the start of a conflict, the GM should spend a few seconds discussing with the players what general kinds of actions are acceptable in this conflict. Most of the time, most of the time will be fairly obvious based on the story. For example, if the PCs are attempting to escape from a flooding room as part of an extended check, it is unlikely they could use interaction-based ability. It is important to note that Mysteries of the Yokai uses a lot of abstraction in combat. The biggest effect of this is that characters do not attack individual health points or do not track individual health points or how much damage they have taken. Besides, players versus enemies. There are two sides in the conflict. Player side, which includes all the PCs and any of their allies, and the enemy side, which includes anyone trying to oppose them. Sometimes the conflict may break out with 3 or more sides. In the Game Master's Guide, the section, 3 or more sided battles. Okay, so there will be rules in the GM section for 3-sided battles, alright.
Mm-hmm.
And then time in combat round. Time is tracked more carefully in conflicts than in story play, but it's still an abstraction representing short bursts of action. A full round usually covers a few seconds to a few minutes, but the nature of the conflict will determine the exact time. In a normal battle, each round might be close to 30 seconds as each character attacks, dodges, and moves around. But in a conflict modeling an invasion of a country, each round can measure weeks or months. Every conflict using the tracker takes place using round. Each character may take 1 turn per round in an order determined by initiative. Characters can react to actions taken against them, but usually only with quick, simple actions. Anything that requires planning or concentration can only be done during a character's turn in the round.
Which I am glad that they address what would happen if you've got 3 sides instead of 2, because that would be one of the obvious questions to ask.
Yeah.
But next after that is focus points, acting during conflict. Mysteries of the Yokai uses a resource called focus points, or FP, to determine how much a character can do. Characters are limited by both time and their own endurance and ability. Since each round usually represents a few seconds, a character can only do so much in the allotted time. Beyond that, characters can only push themselves so far before the body, mind, and soul are too tired to continue. These factors are abstracted into focus points, which are used to take actions. Then we have focus refresh. Each character has a stat called focus refresh. This begins at 3 for starting characters, but can be increased by some abilities such as the diligent focus technique. Focus refresh represents how active the character is and how long they can sustain the demands of a conflict. The higher the stat, the more focus points the character will receive each round to act with. All player characters start with a focus refresh of 3, which I already said. It's nice that they have that in a sidebar though. At the beginning of a new conflict, unless there are specific reasons, such as being surprised or exhausted, each character receives a number of focus points equal to 3 times their focus refresh stat. At the start of each new round after the first, each character receives a number of focus points equal to their focus refresh stat. Focus points are not carried over between conflicts. And we have maximum focus points. You can never have more focus points than 4 times your refresh stat at any time. If more FP would be gained, they are lost. Every action has a focus point cost associated with it. If no cost is listed in the rules, the action costs 1 focus point to take. When you take actions during a round, you pay the required focus points from your remaining pool. You can continue to take actions limited when those actions are appropriate, see below, as long as you pay the focus point cost. Focus points also affect the order in which characters act under the first round of a conflict, see the initiative rules. I'm glad that we have a maximum because that prevents people from turtling, as it were. You know how it is. Somebody would want to try and get the highest amount possible so they can do a shitload of things and just go Nova in one round. Can't really do that here.
Yeah, that'd be a little silly in this system, I think, to try to do that.
I mean, if somebody has a high enough maximum, they can probably do that, but that's more of a late game thing.
Yeah.
But
it stops you from going too crazy with it.
Mm-hmm. But after that, we have action types. And the types we have are full, which you can only take 1 full action during each turn. Simple, you can take as many simple actions as you want, unless otherwise stated. But the same action cannot be taken more than once. Some of simple actions can be taken when it's not your turn. And attack, which is used to inflict tide damage. When you make an attack, choose a character to be the target of that attack. Specific attacks will describe the rules for resolving the attack, but in most cases, this is an opposed check between the attacker and the target. Be sure to read the improvised attacks rules on page 110. Characters can always make an attack if it would be appropriate in the current conflict, even if they haven't purchased a defined attack using their potential. I'm suddenly reminded of how even if you run out of PP in, say, Pokemon, you can still struggle. Okay, it's not going to be the exact same, but the point still stands.
Yeah.
Let's see. Defend is basically a defense action. If you have no appropriate defense, you can always use the simple defense or the last ditch defense universal actions on page 120. And you can use defend actions as many times per round as the character can afford. I am glad for this because whenever I've seen games where the amount of times you can parry or you can try and dodge or the like is arbitrarily like 1 reaction per turn, I always found that never made sense to me. Like the idea that you can only dodge once per turn.
Yeah, it's a little weird.
I mean,
I don't mind when it's like you start to suffer penalties for like additional attacks against you. That I'm okay with, but it can get a little silly.
Yeah, that's one thing. Or and granted, there is still a cost here. The cost is as many as you can afford to pay. And then special, which are rules that ignore or change the standard rules of combat. For example, the intercept universal action. At the end of this chapter on page 120, there is a list of additional actions available to all characters in a conflict. And then we start to get into tide damage, and I'll let you take that.
So, an attack action inflicts tide damage if the check used to take that attack succeeds. The specific base damage for each attack is listed in the stats. Some attacks do a set amount of damage, such as an improvised attack, which does 1. Others might do a variable amount, such as a d6, d3, d3+1, etc. Then, in the case where an attack check is a tie, the check is considered to be successful. Then we get a bunch of nice little charts. I'll actually read the sidebar real quick. The attack defend ties. If the total of an attack check is the same as the... Oh, that's a little weird to have a sidebar, though, that immediately says something like immediately after. Especially since the attack check tie paragraph and the attack defend ties sidebar are the exact same length. But yeah, we get some little pictures with the tied bars as just examples, which, again, very nice. Then we'll go on to damage type. Every attack has a damage type, which is either body, mind, or soul. When an attack doesn't specifically list the damage type, use the domain of the attribute that was used to make the check for that action. For example, a roll made with strength would inflict body damage, while a roll made with insight would inflict soul damage. Then damaging different domains. It's a sidebar. All attacks have a damage type that specifies the domain it affects. If a specific attack doesn't list a damage type, it is based on the attribute used to make the attack check. We've got... all these are pretty self-explanatory. I will read healing, though, because we haven't really talked much about that. Healing is a special kind of damage that works to undo damage already inflicted against the side of the character using the healing attack. This healing attack sounds very funny to me. And then we get armor. Characters that have armor in one or more of the 3 damage types, usually this comes from either the armor technique or simple equipment, but may also be provided by situations in the story, such as taking cover in a combat. When a character takes damage, reduce the damage rolled by the appropriate armor. If the character would take 4 body damage and has armor, body 2, only 2 damage. Then minimum damage, always 1. It will always deal at least 1 damage.
So anybody who's played around with fighting games should be familiar with the concept of chip damage. And because of the way tied damage is set up here, it ends up meaning that even though the damage numbers aren't very high, even just 1 damage is gonna have a significant impact, because the tied bars only go to 10. So just getting like D3 damage, that's still pretty impactful. Then we have margin of success for attacks. Whenever a character succeeds at a check, the results are increased by the margin of success. For every 3 full points by which the roll exceeded the necessary number, the MOS is +1. This can be used by game masters to represent the degrees of success for checks. In the case of attacks, this increases the damage inflicted. This damage is applied after armor is deducted. This represents the fact that a very skilled character can succeed even against heavily protected targets by relying on skill or trickery. Why does this sound so familiar? Then we have healing. Special damage. Roll any dice needed, but do not reduce the damage by the armor. Increase the damage by MOS if any. Healing can only move the tide marker if it's already pushed against the side of the character making the healing attack. Healing will not move the tide marker beyond the 0 space into the opposing side's side. In other words, healing will only remove any damage already taken by the side of the healer. Any remaining damage after the tide marker reaches 0 is ignored.
It's one of those things that sounds like it should be obvious at first, but considering how different this system's handling these things with its tide system, this is a very nice clarification to have in here.
Especially since it's not like it. This isn't a case where each side has their own tide tracker, a la health bars in a fighting game. The tide tracker is shared between both sides, starting at 0 and going from side to side depending on who gets hit.
It's basically a tug of war.
Mm-hmm. Much like the tide going in and out. Then we have improvised attacks. In any conflict, a character can always attempt to use an improvised attack. This is not done when the character doesn't want to use or does not have an appropriate attack. For example, a rowdy bear yokai may be very good at fisticuffs, but probably has very little to do when the party engages in social intrigue. That said, if the character comes up with a creative way to use skills, the GM should allow them to make an improvised attack. In the case of the bear yokai, it might be able to temporarily bluff its way through a checkpoint at night by wearing a heavy cloak and pretending to be a very hairy human.
Sir Barrington.
Yeah. The check used for an improvised attack uses a skill the character has. The skill chosen depends on how the player describes the action to the GM and is subject to the GM's approval. If the GM does not feel any of the character's skills is appropriate, but I feel like that should be an R, not an is, the character can always use an attribute check. An improvised attack always does 1 damage. The attribute and skill, if any, used by the attacker sets the available defense attributes and skills that the defender can choose from. The damage type is always based on the attribute used to make the attack check. Body, mind, or soul is appropriate. Because every successful attack always does a minimum of 1 damage, regardless of armor, this generally means armor doesn't factor into the improvised attacks, unless some external modifier affects the damage. Improvised attacks still do additional damage applied after armor for margin of success. I do like that improvised attacks are not as penalized as, say, in some games, using a weapon that you're not proficient with or using a skill you're not proficient with. Because in those kind of situations, I've always felt the fact that you're getting a lower bonus than somebody who is punishment enough. No need to kick them while they're down.
Generally not too against it in other games. In this one, I'm really happy it's like this, though.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's theoretically going to be conflicts that your character just doesn't have something for.
You can't really... you could make a jack of all trades, but you'd be just dipping slightly into a bunch of different things. Yeah. And even in that situation, you'd have a bunch of skills and attributes that, depending on the situation, you're just not using.
Yeah. So if they try to make it a bit more penalizing in this game in particular, there would be entire conflicts with this tide chart where you just be, I guess I'm just sitting here with my thumb up my butt.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else to do.
Yeah. But then we have signature attacks, and I will let you take that.
So the most common kind of attack that a character will make are their signature attacks. These attacks are purchased with potential. I'll skip this first paragraph since we covered all of this when we talked signature attacks earlier. Mm-hmm. In most cases, any attack purchased with potential should be allowed by the GM in a conflict, regardless of how the particular conflict is defined. A warrior can use their body attack in a peace talk, but instead of actually attacking with a weapon, they could sway the listeners by describing the horrors of war through the experience attained in battle. So I'm going to clarify something I remember saying in one of the past streams about this, because we kind of talked a bit about how you describe your signature attack is important. And I think I was kind of working under the assumption that if you had like a straight described it as a combat one, that's how that signature attack would need to be used. That assumption was incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
Just clarifying that now for anyone who happened to have listened to that stream as well. My bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, GMs should remember that signature attacks were purchased with potential and are a big part of what makes a character interesting to their player. Use the same metric for deciding if an attack is valid as you would for a skill or ability outside of combat. If the theme of the attack is absolutely inappropriate, you can restrict the player to making an improvised attack, but if the player can reasonably describe how they are using their ability, it should be allowed. So I'm really happy with this clarification on signature attacks here. Just because, again, a quick reading of just signature attacks gave me a bit of a different idea. So kudos to them for these clarifications.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get skills as attacks. Skills are the most common basis for improvised attack. Remember that if a character has a skill specialization, it would apply to that improvised attack as well. For example, if a character has taken a specialization in leadership that applies to tactics and battlefield leadership, they would receive a +2 to their attack check when making an improvised attack to coordinate their allies. Again, a lot of really nice clarifications here.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll get to initiative. During a round, each character acts in a specific order. This is called initiative. For each round, the GM writes down each character's name in order of initiative and then resolves each character's turn, asking players for their actions and describing what the NPCs are doing. When combat begins, the initiative order is determined by the events of the story leading up to the conflict. The GM sets the order based on the attitudes, readiness, location, and awareness of the players and NPCs. Starting with the second round, the initiative order is set by each character's remaining focus point. At the end of the previous round, the character with the highest remaining focus point total acts first, followed by the next highest, and so on. When two characters on the same side are tied for initiative, they can decide at time of acting who goes first. When a player and an NPC are tied, the order is determined by the initiative adjustment step described below. If that rule doesn't affect the order, then players act before the NPC. That is an interesting way to handle initiative. I can't say I've ever seen anything like that before.
I'd say the only one that really comes to mind is the shot system of initiative that's in Feng Shui 2. I'm sure that there's others, but that's the big one that comes to mind.
Yeah, just basically it starts off, the DM decides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that also adds an interesting layer of depth to the focus point system.
Yeah, and disincentivizes going Nova with it.
Yeah, because you do that, you're acting later.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how I feel about the DM deciding the first round, but I do like the focus points for deciding the subsequent round.
If I wanted to be chaotic, I do a call a coin flip like they do in a football game. You know, call heads or tails, then decide if you're kicking or receiving. But then right after that we have delaying a turn, which is basically the delay action. So if you've seen delay action in any game, you know how that works. The only rule is that no more than half of one side can delay. So you can also pass, which is a good idea if you're low on focus points. And the full round. A round is considered over when all characters have either taken their turn or passed. If there are characters remaining who have delayed, they may act or pass in order to end the round. And then push rules. At the end of the round, if the tide marker is positioned against one side, not on the 0 space, that side is given the chance to push. If any character on that side decides to push, the round continues, giving each character on both sides one additional turn. If no characters on the side that has the tide bar positioned against them want to push, the other side is given the chance to push. If neither side pushes, the round ends. The side that chooses to push suffers a penalty of -1 to any checks they make during the push. This represents the effort required to attempt to steer the battle in the way that they want. Characters do not receive a focus refresh during the push as they would for a new round. The push is considered to be a part of the same round. It simply gives each character a second turn. I like that, actually. You can literally push your luck and try and act more, but acting more does mean spending more focus points, and you're taking a penalty. So if you want to get aggressive with that, you can. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm right there with you on that.
Let's see. And obviously the and we have the end of round. So when all characters have acted and none choose to push, then the round ends. Once the round ends, the tide bar will break if it is not on 0, and characters will be able to release key. The GM then records the FP total of each character for the next round's initiative and begins a new round. Then we have end of round tide break. At the end of a round, the tide bar must be at 0. If it remains pushed against either side at the end of the round, the tracker is at 1 or higher on either side. The bar automatically breaks. See morale damage, which we'll get to in a minute, inflicting a point of morale damage in the same way it would during the round and resets to 0. It's useful for players to keep this end of round break in mind as the round nears its end or when considering whether to push. The bar will automatically break and reset, inflicting morale damage so that no tide damage will carry over to the new round. And then we have record initiative, which is self-explanatory. Then key release. Next, every character automatically releases 1d6 points of key if they have not exceeded their maximum key. If a character has more key in their pool than their maximum key, they instead release 1 point of key.
What if they're over 1 above their maximum?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
they just hold over their maximum?
The key release step is the only part I'm kind of iffy about. I'm not entirely sure why you'd need to be releasing key at the end of each round like that. At least I may take that back later on, but
yeah, I'm gonna say I feel like this is something to put a pin on because I'm with you. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with this.
Mm-hmm. So next is tide. I'll let you take that.
So tide represents the current state of opposition in a conflict and is affected by every action taken by the characters. When characters assist their allies or harm their opponents, it pushes the tide against the opposing side. Similarly, when the enemies attack the PCs or rally each other, the tide of battle is pushed against the player's side. When the marker has been pushed a certain distance, the tide bar breaks. The GM determines the exact value required for a break based on the circumstances, but for most battles it will be 7. When one side has more or less to fight for than they usually would, the GM can adjust the breakpoint to a different value for that encounter. See modifying breakpoints later on. Note that all damage for an attack is done before checking for the break. This means that no damage will carry over from an attack that breaks the bar. The tide bar breaks when it... Oh, that's another little sidebar note here. Goes over what I just read.
Mm-hmm.
When the tide bar breaks, inflict 1 point of morale damage on the side the bar was pushed again. Then reset the marker to 0. Use markers to represent morale damage on the morale bars on the sides of the conflict tracker. Then morale damage. Morale damage measures the overall progress that one side has achieved towards defeating the other side. Each side in a conflict has a morale tracker. The tracker begins at 0 and increases each time a point of morale damage is inflicted on that side. Unlike Tide, morale does not go back and forth, and it never goes down during the course of a battle. Every character has a limit in battle, representing the maximum physical damage, strain, or spiritual weakness they can take. A character's limit is called their morale threshold. All PCs begin with the morale threshold of 3, but this can be increased by some ability. Each NPC's threshold will be decided by the GM. Weaker enemies or those with less vested interest in battle will usually have lower thresholds, while the fanatical and desperate may have very high thresholds. I am going to add now battle to conflict and combat of things that are borderline interchangeable.
Mm-hmm.
Then morale threshold effects. As the morale damage increases against a side, characters on that side get closer to being unable to battle. When the morale damage is equal to a character's threshold, that character is at their limit. They are still in the battle, but have little left to give. Characters in this situation do not receive focus points at the start of round. If the morale damage ever goes above a character's threshold, that character is immediately forced out of the battle. This does not necessarily mean the character is killed, defeated, or unconscious or similar. It simply means they are unable to continue in the current situation. Rally. Being forced out of a combat is not necessarily the end of character. If the character's allies remain in the battle, they can change the situation, allowing the character an opening or inspiring a return to the fray. Every character has a stat called rally value. At the start of a new round, if the opposing side's morale damage is equal to or higher than the character's rally value, the character can return to combat. Inflicting damage on the opposing side inspires those who have left battle and also represents a change in battle that can allow an opening for return. Once a character is rallied, they cannot be forced out of battle again, regardless of morale damage.
Mm-hmm.
Note that a character who rallies still counts as being beyond their morale threshold for determining the end of battle. Rally is handled similarly for NPCs, but in most encounters they will not rally. See the guide in Bestiary. Player characters begin with a rally value of 4. This can be reduced, allowing a rally at a lower number, by some abilities. And then we get end of conflict. A side loses a conflict when either it has no remaining characters in the conflict, or it has taken morale damage higher than the highest morale threshold of all its characters remaining in the conflict. Note that you can check for these conditions after any action a character takes, not just at the end of the round.
So, because of how this is set up, I'd say combat moves a lot quicker than people might think.
Yeah. I don't think your conflicts are intended to last that long.
No. But even though this is a case of making combat quick while not taking away the tactical impact. I've mentioned this elsewhere, but a lot of people who try and do things to make quicker combat end up taking away a lot of choice and doubling down on abstract on narrativism, which I can understand to a point, but I feel like that's swinging the pendulum too far the other way. Uh, but then we have location and distance in conflict. Misters of the Yokai doesn't track the exact locations of characters in combat. Conflicts use the zone tracker to show the relative distance and investment of characters in an engagement. Characters in the aggressive zone are considered to be closer to the enemy and or more actively involved with the battle. The zone tracker is divided into a player side and enemy side. Characters will always be in one of the three zones, aggressive, balanced, or cautious, and will always be on their own side of the tracker. This doesn't mean that in reality the characters aren't moving around the field, including engaging further away enemies. The tracker abstracts exact positions and instead focuses on each character's overall plan. Then we have range and choosing targets. Every attack action in the game has a range value. When a value isn't specifically listed, such as when using an improvised attack, the attack has a range of 1. Because combat is an abstraction, range is not an exact check to see if a character is close to a target. The range of an attack measures its general effectiveness, but doesn't restrict where the character is allowed to attack. After all, because characters stay in their own side's zones, that would make it impossible for a range 1 weapon to attack opponents in the cautious zone. Characters can still attack outside of their range, but it will cost more focus points. This represents the effort required by the character to push past opposing defenders and reach the target. When making an attack, it costs additional FP to target a character outside the attack's range. Completely ignore any zones within the attack's range and any characters in those zones. The attack costs 1 additional FP for each remaining zone and for each opposing character other than the target within those zones. So changing zones, you can change zones with a move action, which costs 1 FP. Making attacks at range, it costs an additional FP for each zone beyond range. The 3 zones are aggressive, balanced, and cautious.
Now, this is something I'm hoping we get some examples on a bit later, since I'm not seeing it here. Because while I like the idea of still using these zones based off character investment, what exactly in, say, a debate stage is going to put you in aggressive, balanced, or cautious?
Yeah, and
because this is used for everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the example that they give is a combat example.
Which it works perfectly great for combat. But it needs to be taken into account this is used for more than just combat.
Yeah. Unless the implication is for non-combat affairs, you would just use morale and tide.
Considering it mentions level of investment, I don't believe that's the case. Which is why I think we could probably use a few more examples on how that would be played out.
Mm-hmm. So
this is one of the few times in this book I've kind of come across as this. We need some actual details and explanation, because it's been really good up until this point about that.
Yeah. So next we have using ki in conflict.
All right. So ki is a broad term that covers energy that makes up all of the world. Ki can be found in nature itself, in the focused training of martial arts, magic of geomancy, brushstrokes of a master calligrapher. Ki is a resource used to pay for some kinds of actions and abilities. Unlike focus points, which are generated at the start of rounds when spent, ki can be used as much as a player wants. However, wielding excessive ki has a price. Using too much of it at once can cause an unhealthy imbalance in the character. When this happens, the characters suffer penalties to all of their actions until they can recover from the strain. Your key pool. When a character takes an action with a key cost of 1 or more, the character adds that amount of key to their key pool. Key pools usually begin empty at the start of combat. A character is unaffected by the key in their pool unless the total exceeds their key limits. This explains the key reduction at the end of combat earlier.
Yeah, I think we were thinking of key as a full thing that gets emptied, not the other way around.
Yes. That makes much more sense. I am now okay with that earlier description and how that worked. Now, every character has a key limit based on their total potential. For every full 25 potential, the character's key limit increases by 2. Which means starting characters that begin with a total of 100 have a key limit of 8. Some abilities can also increase a character's key limit. As long as the character's key pool does not exceed their key limit stat, there is no effect. When the character has more key in their pool than their limit, but less than twice their limit, they suffer a -1 modifier to any checks they make for each point above their limit. If a character has even more than twice their key limit in their pool, they are immediately forced out of combat as soon as that action resolves, regardless of morale threshold. This represents a strain on the character, causing them to fall unconscious or otherwise be unable to act. This character is usually not allowed to rally, but the GM may allow them to return later in battle if enough time has passed for them to recover. And releasing key. A character's key will naturally return to a healthy state in time, but resting or taking a moment to relax and clear one's head can speed up the process. Key pools automatically empty at the end of combat. During the end of round process, any character with less key in their pool than their limit automatically reduces 1d6 points of key. Each player rolls a die and removes that much key from their pool. Characters that are above their limit are so strained that the process is not as easy, and you can only remove 1 point. Characters can also take key balance, and can take the key balance universal action found on page 120. And key abilities maintain. Some abilities with key cost have the maintain option in their description. This option allows a player to continue using the ability without having to restart it with another action or more focus points. Each maintain ability has a cost. Usually this will be listed with the ability itself, but when it isn't, the maintain cost will be the same as the key cost required to activate the ability. Maintain costs are paid by constantly having that much key in the character's pool. This key cannot be released in any way as long as the ability is being maintained. In essence, that many points of key are locked into the pool. A player can choose to stop maintaining an ability at any time outside of conflict. During a conflict, ending a maintain ability can only be done during the character's turn, but is not an action and does not interfere with anything else the character does. I quite like this.
And I think a good analogy when it comes to key is that it is not a MP setup. We already have that with focus points. Instead, I'd liken this to a heat mechanic. Especially say the way heat works with certain weapons in say BattleTech, where especially energy weapons you won't have to consume ammo for them, but you will generate heat every time you fire them. Get yourself too much heat and you'll undergo a shutdown, which can be overwritten. But if you go past that threshold, you may have a bad case of explosions.
Yeah.
You
can keep pushing and pushing and pushing up until the moment you can't push no more.
And for those of you who are going to say phrasing at me, I just had to endure the Let's Ram It music video last night, which is all of the phrasing.
Or, if you want something, a slightly more relatable way to explain this, you can keep pushing your arms at a workout or just working at a job, stop and recover. The moment you push yourself to the point you hurt yourself, you're not recovering that quickly anymore. That is effectively what you're doing with ki.
Yes. And with right after that is conflict resolution story effects, which is more of a narrative thing. It goes into how a lot of the mechanics here are abstractions. But I don't think for the purposes of what we do, that would be kind of redundant. And right after that is universal actions. We have say improvised attack, which is a full action that costs one focus. Simple defense, which is one focus. It uses whatever defense skill you're going to be using. Last ditch defense does not use focus points, but you only get the 3d6 roll, and that's it. I mean, you might get special modifiers, but you're basically preying on RNGesus to bail you out. But it is something you can do for free. See, then you have ready, which is a full action. Doesn't have any cost, and lets you recover focus equal to your focus refresh. Up to the maximum, of course. Then we have ki balance, which is a full action where you can spend 1 FP to roll D3 worth of ki. But you cannot use it during a push. So it is nice that when it comes to recovery, you have to balance whether or not you're going to focus on recovering force points or focus on reducing ki.
Yeah.
But see, then we have intercept, which is a defend action. The FP varies. It's equal to half. You choose a number. The action costs the FP equal to half that number, rounded up. Then you choose to either attack the original target with a negative modifier to their attack check equal to the chosen number, or attack your character with a bonus to their attack check equal to the chosen number. Your character then defends as normal as if they were the target. If more than one character want to intercept the same attack, each character chooses the number they want to apply. The character with the highest chosen number intercepts the attack, and the other characters do not take this action. So, give so I see where it's going. It's basically if an attack is intercepted, you can choose to power through it, but you're taking a penalty, or you can attack who's intercepting with a bonus. Because they're trying to get in the line of fire. Then we have cover, which is a defend action, costs 2 FP. And you make a defense check when another character on your side makes a defense check. So it's basically a support action. Then counterattack. Instead of using another defend action, you can use any signature attack that makes its checks using a skill that's included in the defense skills of the attack targeting you. Pay all the costs as using the signature attack as normal, including additional focus points if the enemy attacking you is further than your range, plus an additional 1. If you lose the check, the margin of success increases the damage you receive for every 2 points the attack succeeded by, instead of every 3. If you win the check, you inflict damage equal to your margin of success to the attacker, in addition to receiving no damage. The domain of this damage is the same as your signature attack. And finally, there's move, which is exactly what you think it is. Spend 1 FP to
Move.
move. Uh, the defensive actions I find interesting because you have a barely manageable set of choices with them. But that more or less covers the way conflict is going to work. What did you think about the combat system overall? Not the combat, the conflict system
Yeah, the combat.
overall.
They say combat several times too. It's fine.
Plus old habits.
Yeah. Again, for things like the movement zones, I would definitely like some clarification. Otherwise, I'm quite happy to have a decent array of defensive actions here. I think it offers a decent variety, simple resolution, and it does a good job at keeping even characters that just end up in a situation they have no skills, really relevant skills, able to actually do something and participate.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, I'm positive on the conflict resolution in this game.
I think the only problem we had is exactly how the range bands would work in
Yeah,
non-combat scenarios.
yeah. As I said, we need some clarification on some stuff because if there isn't some, I think I just run it as assume they're all ineffectively the same range, just for simplicity's sake.
Mm-hmm. Like when it comes to combat, this setup works perfectly fine.
Again, if we had some more concrete examples for non-combat conflicts, I don't think we'd have this issue.
Yeah.
Especially since everything's worded as if it's in combat.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a bit to the detriment to this section too. Is I think they worded it that way because that's kind of how most people are used to reading tabletop books, is combat oriented in a lot of ways. But I think it would have benefited this game to not write it in that way.
Mm-hmm. But
Because yeah, I didn't. If we hadn't read a bunch of the stuff earlier and just looked through the conflict resolution, I would probably be assuming this was a combat-oriented game by how it was written. So I think that's what a number of people are kind of going to take away just for their thought process after going through this.
mm-hmm. I'm also a bit curious what the effect of the tide bar would be if it doesn't hit the break point.
I remember saying, like, at the end of the round, if it's on one side over the other, it does break. And it resolves to the 1 damage to whatever side it broke on.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming mid-combat or mid-conflict, you could theoretically break that tide bar multiple times.
I'm not entirely sure if that's the intent. If that's the intent, because if that's the like, imagine at the end of a round and the tide bar and the break point is 7, but the tide bar is only at 1. Like, would that still do morale damage?
Yes.
I
distinctly remember seeing that.
I'm not entirely sure if I would go with that. Oh. Because I honestly think that might make things go a little too fast, depending on the situation.
Yeah.
I'd probably have it that it only if it's under the break point, it just resets. The big reason I point that out is keep in mind there's only 6 points worth of morale. And
see, if you reset it every time, though, theoretically, again, this is all think without practice. If that keeps resetting and multiple rounds of nothing breaking, that could also cause the combat or conflict to needlessly drag on. Because there are healing abilities.
mhm. So it's I don't quite agree. I don't quite agree with the approach, but I understand why it's done.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, I still enjoy the conflict tracker, and I enjoy the abstraction because I'm growing a little bit tired of doing um grid combat and full mapping as a default. So having alternatives is very nice. Uh, the Now, I believe next time we do this, we will be doing our grand finale when it comes to Mysteries of the Yokai. Actually no, I take that
We
back.
did have conflict trackers, but I'm like, haven't we kind of already covered that? I don't know if we really need a combat tracker section.
Um, there was the whole thing about using the conflict tracker, but that was in the GM section as more of an advice thing. So, yeah, I think we're going to be going straight into final thoughts when we return on this in 2 weeks.
You may be asking why 2 weeks, because I will be in Anime Matsuri next week, so there will be no Valley of the Judged.
Well, I'm gonna be doing a fill in with a one shot because originally the plan was to do the roast of Jeremy Jack that week, but since he double booked, that is not going to be happening. And all that this means is I just have to move up all the stuff scheduled, especially for next season, um, ahead 1 week, which is not a deal breaker for me. I've done this kind of thing before. But that will more or less do it for this particular episode. And we'll be back here I will be back here next week. Monarch will not, but I hope to see you all again soon for that. So until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.